So William's kindly volunteered to do a presentation and give you an update on the recent changes that were made to the NEC4 suite in light of the fact that we've had a slight change in plans. So over to you, William.
Thank you very much. Okay, so as Chris rightly says, this presentation is looking at the recent official NEC4 amendments. By that, I mean the amendments that were published in January 2023. So within the last 2 months, we have a further set of amendments just to be aware of. So you all know me from before. Hello. In terms of the agenda for this, so as I say, I'm going to focus on those January 2023 amendments, but for those of you that don't know, there are subsequent amendments to the NEC4 2017 edition, which were published in October 2020 and January of 2019. I'll touch on those briefly, just to give you an overview of what they do, just in case you're not currently using them. The key point is that all of these are available on the NEC website. So if you want to download any of these amendments, you can get them for free on the website. Or if you're currently buying your NEC contracts, if you've bought it within the last month or so, the amendments that you see on the slide will actually be within the contract itself. So just be careful with what contract you're actually looking at as the takeaway there. I'm also going to briefly touch on X29, which deals with climate change, and for any other Northern Irish voices in the room, touching on YNI, which I drafted on behalf of the NEC, which effectively makes the NEC contract work in Northern Ireland, because, believe it or not, the law is slightly different. So, by way of a helicopter view of what these amendments are all about, I'm going to be focusing on the amendments to the long contracts, so our ECC, Engineering and Construction contract, and also the amendments to the short contracts, and specifically the engineering and construction short contract. By way of a broad overview, so an amendment has been made to the working areas and how that interoperates with the schedule of cost components to effectively modernise the contract, given that people now work sometimes from home and places other than the working areas. So I'll explain that and I'll show you exactly what that amendment looks like. Using the contractor's design, that's effectively an IP clause or a change to the intellectual property provisions of the contract. It's very, very minor and probably something that would have been implied anyway, but it has been added to introduce some clarity to the contract. Adjudication, so a big one for me as an adjudicator is the fact that we can now dictate the timetable or direct the timetable of the adjudication process. Under the original wording of W2, all of the submissions had to be made within 14 days, which was just impractical for everyone. And in reality, it didn't even happen anyway. The adjudicators were normally taking control of the process. But now, what happens in reality has been contractualized. And then we have some amendments to secondary option X22, which deals with early contractor involvement. And I might steal John because he has some budding comments to say about that. And as I say, we'll touch on that in a bit of detail also. The two perhaps most significant amendments in my perspective, again I advise a range of contractors and small contractors, big contractors, is the amendments that have been made to the short contracts. So under the short contract, they didn't have the ability to limit the liability of the contractor to 100% of the prices or a set financial amount. The equivalent of what we had within, X18 of the long form contract to limit the liability of the contractor. And similarly, also limiting the liability of the contractor in terms of their design responsibility. So similar to X15 of the long form contract, where you can effectively cap their responsibility for design to using reasonable skill and care. Takes away the potential for that fitness for purpose obligation, which could otherwise be implied. So that's what we're going to look at. There's a few more amendments just to be aware of. So if you're dealing with the likes of the term service contracts or the professional services, there are some subtle changes, but these are the main ones in my opinion and the ones that we're going to be focusing on. The way I'd maybe like to run this session, if there are any questions as we go along, feel free to stop me at the time and we can deal with it on the slide because we are going to be looking at the actual wording of the contract. So, in terms of working outside of the working areas, again that sounds a little bit odd when you say it, but a couple of amendments have been made to both the short schedule of cost components, which we use with option A and option B, and to the full schedule of cost components, which is used for all of the other main options. Just as a very quick reminder as to what the schedules of cost components are, under A and B, you use them to assess compensation events. If a cost is on the list, the schedule of cost components, it's part of the contractor's defined cost and they can recover it as part of their compensation event quotation. That's it in a nutshell. The schedule of cost components, however, is used in a lot more detail within option C, D, E and F, because it's used to value all of the contractor's payments, not only compensation events that can change the target upwards or downwards, but also for the contractor's payments as they go along. So just be conscious that there's potentially a lot of difference when you're using this NEC4 2023 amendment within option C, D, E and F. So in terms of what the original wording did, the original wording within the people cost section, so cost component number 1, set out that you can recover the cost of your staff, people who work within the working areas, people who come to the working areas from time to time, people who are not directly employed by the contractor but who are paid for them based on the proportion that they're on the site. That wording within the schedule of cost components all focuses around those individuals being in the working areas. What is the working areas, you might say? It includes the site. It's a defined term. So you go and you look up the definition. It includes the site and anywhere else you have defined as working areas. Contractors quite often would put in the likes of a meeting room within their head office or something equivalent to that, especially under the likes of option C, D, E and F, where they might have quite a lot of design resource or commercial resource not actually working on the site. So the point is, if those individuals are not within the working areas, you can't recover. So if you have a QS who normally works within the working areas, but who now happens to work from home 2-3 days a week, the time they're spending at home, you can't recover it. That's under the original contract. That has been changed under this amendment to allow you to recover the cost of them working from home, to recover any time they spend working on the contract, even though they're no longer within the working areas. So let's look at what that actual amendment looks like. So this is what I described before. This is the people costs that can be recovered under the schedule of cost components. This first one is the likes of your site agent, people who are employed by the contractor and who work on the site. The next one is the likes of your contracts manager who come from the site from time to time, etc. This lists out everything you can claim. And the point is, you can only calculate this amount by multiplying the rate for those people, so for your site agent, your contracts manager, whatever, based on the time they spend within the working areas. If they're not on site, if they're not on the working areas, you can't recover. That has been replaced with this, whereby you multiply the people rate by the time that they spend working on the contract. That's a fairly significant difference when it comes to option C, D, E and F, where you might have people working from home. So for example, you've got a site engineer working a 6-week on, 1-week off rotation, which wouldn't be uncommon if you're working in the Outer Hebrides, storing away and that sort of thing. Before, you would only be able to recover 6 weeks of that engineer's time, even though that other week that they're at home in the head office, they're actually working on the project. They're dealing with compensation event quotations, they're dealing with orders, subcontract orders, etc. You technically speaking wouldn't be able to recover that time. Whether or not you actually enforce that as a client is a slightly different thing, but strictly speaking, applying the black letter of the contract, it's not a recoverable cost because it doesn't form part of defined cost. Whereas under this new amendment, the full 7 weeks is recoverable. Everybody happy with that? Another example, a working from home example, we've got a commercial manager, again, let's say it's an option C contract, working in the office, dealing with all of the costs that have to be prepared on an open book basis. They're working 3 days a week in head office, which is part of the working areas, and 2 days a week from home. Strictly speaking, and whether or not you enforced it, as I say, is a different story. Only 3 of those 5 days would be recoverable, but now it's all recoverable. That is the change which has been made to the working areas. Are there any questions on that? All fairly clear? In my opinion, this is going to be fairly significant, as I say, under option C, D, E and F. Not as much under A and B, but certainly for those options that revolve around defined cost. This next one is a lot more straightforward than the last one. It's an intellectual property clause. It's been tweaked under the standard NEC contract, the old version. Strictly speaking, the client could only use and copy the contractor's design. In other words, the essence of the design itself, what it's aiming and trying to do. That was problematic before because on most occasions clients want the intellectual property and the ability to license over the actual documents themselves, the drawings, the CAD files, the BIM files that have been prepared for the design. So a simple amendment has been made to clause 22.1 to do just that, to give the client the license to use the documents which have been prepared for the design. Dead straightforward, probably implied anyway, if you were to take a really strict view on that. But by adding it in, it's added clarity to the process, which is welcome for everyone. Any questions on that one? As I say, fairly straightforward and hopefully not too difficult. This next one, if anybody was here in my last presentation, you're not going to have to worry about this because you're not going to be adjudicating against one another. You're going to be getting disputes resolved. But in the event that you do, this clause changes how the adjudication process works. So before, all of the submissions in an adjudication, strictly speaking, had to be made within 14 days of the referral notice being issued. That creates a host of problems. It's designed for the adjudicator's benefit to give them 14 days, 14 clear days with all of the files and paper in front of him or her to make the decision in this period. But practically speaking, that never happened. If you're an adjudicator, you would normally give the responding party something like 7 to 14 days. You'll then normally have a reply. So by that stage, you're well into this period anyway. So the drafters have ultimately updated the contract to reflect what was happening in reality, and it now looks more like this, whereby the adjudicator can decide on the procedure and direct when the submissions happen effectively. As I say, in reality, that's what's happening anyway, but it has been updated just to reflect what happens in reality. Any questions on that? And again, what happens if you're getting replies, rejoinders, etc. towards this end of the process? Your rights as an adjudicator to ask for an additional 14 days from the referring party is preserved, and also the ability to ask for an extension beyond that with the agreement of both parties is preserved also. Early contractor involvement then. So I might actually get John just to jump in and give a bit of an explanation on this one. These are my thoughts on the process. So in short, early contractor involvement is a two-stage process all under the one contract, and the amendments that have been made to clarify the process. What exactly happens if you're not going to proceed on to stage 2? Clarifying that point that you made earlier about the ground conditions, etc., and transferring that risk. But did you want to jump in, John, with any questions or queries?
If you say what you're going to say, and then I'll either contradict you or say this is really necessary or whatever.
Don't forget about that favour I did for you earlier. So as I say, further flexibility within stage 1, so the ability to change the site information. It didn't really make sense before for a contractor to come in at stage 1, do some additional site investigation, and then still to judge the adverse ground conditions clause against the original site information. That just didn't make sense, to be honest. So they have changed that, and as John will probably say, he amended that anyway to add that in.
I did too. That might be the limit of my contributions. Yeah, I've done that.
The next point there is greater clarity over what happens if you're not going to proceed on to stage 2. So with any two-stage approach, you have that break point in the middle where you've done the ECI, you decide whether or not you want to proceed, and then you proceed to get the thing built. Again, that worked under X22, but it wasn't perfect. So some of the things that they have done include making sure if you don't want to proceed to stage 2, that all of that work is removed from the scope, which brings it into line with your intention that nothing further is going to happen, works on the ground. And also, in line with that, it updates the completion date, which previously would have been at the end of stage 2, to be at the end of stage 1, just to draw a line neatly under each stage of the process.
So this was really important because one of the things that previously there was no, in X22, there was no reference to termination, whereas there is now. And what happened therefore, you go is, okay, the works are the early contractor involvement, detailed design and construction of, yeah? Oh, actually, I've decided not, and that would let you say the ECI works were worth £10 million. The full works will be worth £100 million, yeah? Oh, I'm going to terminate after 10 million. 100 million's only estimated, yeah? But hang on, I'm terminating for any other reason. Oh, terminating for any other reason allows the fee percentage to be applied to the remainder of the outstanding works. So now as a contractor, do I get 10% on that 90%? Yippee! Terminated, or I don't want it to proceed to stage 2, yeah? Could be the logical deduction. So clarifying this, which yes, I did before, is really, really good, yeah? I know you've got yours.
Final slide. Again, just reflects another point that John has previously made, that prior to this amendment, the likes of ground conditions was judged against the site information provided all the way at the start of stage 1. And the same is true with the likes of X2, changes in the law, which is judged against the contract date, which under the NEC is the date the contract was formed effectively, which will be way at the start of stage 1. So what this amendment does is move that date to effectively the date at the start of stage 2. So the contractor is deemed to have taken on board any legal changes up to the date of stage 2, and thereafter, if you have X2, it's a client risk. Makes total sense in reality. Why it wasn't there before, questionable. And the same thing applies to the likes of the prevention clause 60.119. It again is judged against the contract date. So what would the experienced contractor have allowed for at the contract date as one of the 3-part test or 4-part test under that clause? And it's moved that date to the start of stage 2. You know, the likes of COVID-19 is a prime example. Contract date, you know, December 2019. Would any experienced contractor have allowed for COVID-19 and the problems caused by it? Absolutely not, unless you're something to do with Wuhan in China. Very unlikely. But going into the likes of April, March, June 2020, if the contract date is at that point in time, it changes the dynamics completely. What would the experienced contractor allow for in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic? I don't know, but they would have allowed for something as the takeaway. So moving that date is actually quite significant, and it does change what will effectively amount to a force majeure or prevention event under 60.119.
No more comments?
Yeah, so again, in my opinion, very useful addition. Next one is on to the short contracts, and thank you very much, John, for your contribution. This, as I say, from my perspective, dealing with both large main contractors and also small ones, is a very significant change indeed. So under the full NEC contract, the engineering and construction contract, you have the ability to use X15, which limits the contractor's liability for design to doing what a reasonable consultant would do, exercising reasonable skill and care. Brian mentioned the case earlier of MT Hogard and E.ON. That should be a case that you put a big note beside within your notes, because it sets out the interface between having a fitness for purpose obligation. It has to last for 20 years, 50 years, whatever, and having that lower standard, which is just doing what a reasonable consultant would do. And the point is, if you don't have X15, you can get into that scenario, that MT Hogard problem of having competing standards. And as the court said in that case, they aren't competing. They will be read as a whole. One will be the ceiling, and that's what you have to do. You would have to be held to that fitness for purpose standard. So all in all, having X15, good thing, contractor, to put it in as simple terms as possible. The problem was we didn't have the ability to do that under the short contracts prior to 2023, but post 2023, we now have the ability to add in what is effectively X15 into the short form. The way that you do that is we have a contract data entry. It's actually not on the slide there. There's an entry within the contract data, which is basically a yes or no statement. Do you want to limit the contractor's liability for design to reasonable skill and care, yes or no? And if you put in yes, then it triggers all of the other design requirements, like the ability to require professional indemnity insurance, which again was not a requirement of the short form, but it is now if you want to bring in what is effectively X15 into the short form. Any questions on X15? Contractors in the room working under the short form, you want that in, is the short answer. You're not going to get insured for any risks design-wise that go above and beyond exercising reasonable skill and care. That's all your professional indemnity insurance policy will cover you for, and for that reason, if you want to insure that risk, it needs to be in there. On the same note, the short contract didn't have the ability to place an overall cap on the contractor's liability. So if the building falls down, breach of contract's terminated, how much can the employer go after you for? That's what we're talking about here. Under the standard short form, that was an unlimited amount. It was uncapped. If that building fell down, caused pollution in the river, and caused all of these other problems, you'd be on the hook for that as the contractor. But because of the way that this amendment has been made, you now have the ability to place a financial limit on that, which would typically be something like 150% of the original prices. In other words, the cost of knocking down what you've built and rebuilding it, or something equivalent to that. This is no different to how option X18 works under the standard long form engineering and construction contract. So they've just brought in a secondary option effectively from the long form and brought it into the short. In my opinion, very, very useful. If I'm ever advising contractors, I always advise them to get that limit of liability in there, because the last thing that you want is an uncapped liability that will sink your entire business. At least by having some sort of cap, you know what the amount's going to be. And to an extent, you could potentially insure against it. Any questions on X18 or the equivalent under the short form? Takeaway, contractors, get it in. Mike?
I look at caps on contracts quite regularly, and if you're building something, a £50 million project, and you agree the cap at £50 million, that will take the majority of tier 2. That'll take the majority of sort of tier 2 and tier 3 contractors under.
Yeah.
And I do think that employers, when they look at caps on liability, are totally unreasonable, because paying the equivalent of the total contract sum is just not fair or equitable or ever going to happen.
Yeah. Well, the starting point for my negotiations is something more like 10%, which I think most contractors would be pushing for. But as you rightly say, from the employer's perspective, that's untenable, and they do try to get it an awful lot higher.
Yeah, I mean, I'd start at 10%, and I think my experience is you end up at 50%, save for things which are like deliberate default or willful default, or things that can be recovered under insurances.
And that's the other point maybe to note here. Not only are you placing, a one-sentence cap on the liability, this clause also imports all of the other language that we have within X18, which does exactly that. It carves out certain aspects from that limit on liability, things that can be recovered under insurances, etc. Thanks, Mike. So don't forget about the others, and by others I mean the other NEC amendments. So there has been, at this point, 3 sets of official amendments published by the NEC. We've just looked at the 2023 version, but don't forget about 2019 and 2020 as well. The 2019 amendments are quite interesting. The first one deals with the assessment of delay, so clause 63.5 under the contract, and how exactly the dividing date works. That's actually a very important point to understand how you assess compensation events. So if you are in the business of assessing compensation events, either client side or contractor side, you need to understand why that amendment has been made. The other point I'll make about this one, which people often forget about, is the NEC has published practice notes on how to assess the likes of delay. Those very common scenarios when you have an accepted program that is out of date. What happens when you've got multiple compensation events stacking up on one another that all have delaying impact, but if you assess one of them, the delay under the others falls away. We've all seen that scenario. Don't forget, when you're reading that amendment, to also read the practice note. I think it's practice note number 1, sets out how to treat and deal with delay under the NEC. The next one is fairly minor, fairly trivial. What happens if a senior rep kicks the bucket or leaves the business? How to get them replaced. Previously, you couldn't replace them. That's just a minor amendment. PI insurance requiring the contractor to provide that certificate on a regular basis, again, doesn't really bear talking about. The October 2020 amendments are to do with legal changes in the industry or potential legal issues. So this first one came off of the back of a case called Triple Point Technology, which was all about what happens to the ability to claim delay damages in the event that you terminate the contractor. Does the ability to levy delay damages end when you terminate them? Does it end whenever the works are finished by another subcontractor, or is it somewhere in between? That's effectively what that case dealt with. X7 of the NEC didn't deal with that problem up front. It said that the ability to levy delay damages ends at completion effectively. So by forward thinking, the NEC drafters built in the ability to end the ability to levy liquidated damages if the contract is terminated. So the takeaway is, NEC contract in delay, if you terminate the contractor when they're in delay, you terminate the ability to levy liquidated damages. That's the takeaway. This next one, again, a case called Rochford and Kilhan, which was a High Court case here in England. And it was all about what happens to payment terms if you link the final date for payment to receipt of a VAT invoice. And the short answer is, in an obiter comment, Justice Cockrell, I think was her name, she decided that that can't happen. You need to have final dates for payment fixed to rigid points in time. So having something which is variable, like a VAT invoice, which is how some of the professional services options were originally worded, would potentially be unlawful. So to get ahead of that problem, the NEC drafters went ahead and fixed that. So if you are dealing with professional services agreements, PSC, term service, etc., make sure that you're making that amendment part of your contract by incorporating it. Option X29, I'm not going to get into this in too much detail. I think there is a session later today on sustainability, or at least a workshop at some point. The one I'm replacing. The other point to note, we have Veronica Flint-Williams in the room, who I think was one of the 4-person drafting team associated with X29. So if you do have any questions on X29, there's no better person than Veronica. What it effectively tries to do, and it's a laudable aim at that, is put climate change at the forefront. They could have called this clause whatever they want, but they called it climate change, which is driving us as an industry towards looking after the environment. If the environment isn't protected, as time rolls on, we're not going to have an earth to build projects on effectively. So the way it does that is by defining upfront climate change requirements. So that could be the likes of having extra electric vehicles on the site, building carbon targets into the project, using certain levels of recycled material, having to source aggregate from a certain radius from the project, lots of different things that you can think of. Building them in as climate change requirements. And the point is that will become part of the scope and the contractor has to do it. What happens if the contractor does not perform the works in accordance with the scope? What's that? 11.14? Defect, absolutely. So it will become a defect and the contractor has to correct that. So that's how it ties in with the original language of the NEC. What it can also do is incentivize the contractor both negatively and positively via this extra requirement at the back, which is the performance table. So to use our example, if the contractor provides extra electric vehicles or reduces carbon even further than the climate change requirements, then you can pay them extra money. It's a positive incentive, it's a carrot effectively. But the other end of that stick, or the opposite side of that coin, is you can negatively incentivize the contractor. If they don't provide enough electric vehicles, they pay you money. If they don't provide recycled aggregate within a certain radius, they pay you money. In my opinion, and not to slag too much, Veronica, this can actually be done already under the standard NEC, under the likes of option X17, which deals with low performance damages, and X21, which deals with KPIs. But what X29 does slightly better is it goes in and deals with how you update all of the other mechanisms, the compensation mechanism, etc. So in my opinion, this is actually the better way to do it. Yes, you could shoehorn it slightly under X17 and X21, but this is the way to do it in my opinion. Okay. Finally, I think, this is option Y, NI. So for those of you that don't know, if you're working in England, Wales or Scotland, construction contracts are governed by the Housing Grants, Construction and Regeneration Act 1996, as amended in 1997. If you're in Northern Ireland, we have a different version of that, which is the Construction Contracts Northern Ireland Order of 1997. Does exactly the same thing, but it's called something different. And how we work out time frames for the adjudication, etc., is also slightly different. For reasons that we'll not get into, we don't recognise bank holidays. We work over Christmas. But if the date ends on a Sunday, we don't like that. DUP, I think, don't like Sundays and that sort of thing. Therefore, we have to change the timeframes. So we now have this clause, YNI, which effectively updates the contract to work in Northern Ireland if you're ever working there. As I say, I drafted this for the ICE. I also drafted the Irish version as well. So if you're working in the Republic of Ireland, they've got a totally different set of laws. YIR will update the contract for work in the Republic as well. So, final slide, how to get everything incorporated here. So what I've got is just an extract from the start of a contract data, part 1 entry, and the best way to do it is just write it in to your contract T's and C's at the outset. So as you can see here, you're identifying what the contract is, NEC, Engineering and Construction Contract 2017, what your main options are, secondary options, and also write in which amendments apply. Just be careful is the takeaway here. I have an NEC contract that was published in 2017, so whenever I'm reading it, I don't see any of these amendments. If you bought your contract in 2021, you'll have these in it. If you bought your contract last week, it'll have all 3. And they all look the same. They don't say anything different on the front page, so just be careful is the takeaway there. And make sure if you want the amendments to be incorporated, that you reference them correctly to get them incorporated by reference. So that's me. That's the sales pitch for a course I do. I don't think I'm allowed to say that, but it's there anyway. So we'll see you all later. And thank you all very much. Thanks.